In this lecture, which I've called the 1950s bubble, I'm going to talk a little bit more than about just the 1950s. Beware historians who like to take one historical time period and make it bigger. We like to say things like, the Hundred Years' War, when in fact was longer than 100 years, and the long 19th century, and other things like that. Well, I'm going to be talking about more than just the 1950s in today's class. But what I want to talk about, and the reason why the 50s are important, is in the church and the society today, the 1950s have a very strangely normative quality. There are still so many people who grew up in the church of that and the society of that world and became so influential in founding and establishing and running the society. And it has, therefore, this sort of normative quality in the society and the church. We tend to think that everything that's happened afterwards has been departing from a sort of immutable, perennial norm that existed from that time and before. The truth is that the 1950s were not normal in the history of the church or the society. There was a tremendous growth in the number of Jesuits and of priests at that time. The ratio of priests to people in the church was never so small. There were never so many priests for each person as in the 1950s. There was this meteoric growth leading up to the 1950s. And then there was a crash that's inevitable when you grow at that scale. But the problem is we got very used to that scale of success, that many Jesuits, that amount of wealth and prestige and other things like that. And the truth is, it wasn't very normal. And I think we need to dispel that myth in order to understand what came after. The other thing about the 1950s is that they were a time of outward consolations for the society. We were so successful and we're growing and everything just seems to be smooth sailing. And the question is, were we discerning well amid all that growth, or were we sort of riding on our success instead of relying on Christ? Ignatius says in the Rules of Discernment that the one who is in consolation ought to be humble and to abase himself as much as possible and reflect how little he is worth in the time of desolation when that grace or consolation is absent. Were we humble in our consolations in the 1950s? I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that perhaps we lacked a certain humility, and that was the cause of some problems. And I think that's important for us to consider. We have a lot of reasons to be humble today in the church and the society, and perhaps overweening pride is not a society-wide problem, because with the abuse scandal, with the lowering of numbers, with the lack of prestige, with the sort of way that religion is derided or mocked or cast aside in a lot of modern discourse, humility maybe comes a little easier to us today, but that doesn't mean we can't get caught up in pride and success. Certainly we still can and do around the success of our institutions, or we can take pride in a Jesuit pope or other things like that. And what consolations call us to is humility, to keep us grounded in that fundamental source of our joy and our hope and our faith, which is our relationship to Christ. So I want to look at that rule for discernment from that perspective. I'm going to use, for a lot of what I talk about today, I'm going to use the example of the United States. It is not because I am trying to make this course about the United States. There's two reasons I'm going to use the example of the United States. One is that the society's successes and its pride were particularly evident in the United States. And the other reason is because that's where I have a lot of data, a lot of good data that I can use to make my points. Just the limits of my own knowledge are always a part of how I have to decide to present these things. So I just want to be honest about that. And so I'm going to use some data from the United States. In 1977, in the journal Studies in the Spirituality of Jesuits, a Jesuit named Joseph Becker published an article that had information about changes in membership in the society, and that's where some of the information I'm about to talk about comes from. So in 1914, so 100 years after the restoration of the society, there were 16,894 Jesuits, 16,894. In 1964, there were 35,788 Jesuits in the society. That's an enormous growth in the number of Jesuits. That's an enormous growth, an uncharacteristically big growth in the society. So if we look in the United States at entrances into the society, we can see this kind of as it grows. Between 1930 and 1934, there were 219 roughly novices entering every year. 1935 to 1939, 218. 1940 to 44, 232. 1945 to 1949, 300. 1950 to 1954, 306, 1955 to 1958, 344. That's a very fast growth. At the same time, people are going to our schools more. Between 1880 and 1954, we went from 4,000 students at our Jesuit high schools and universities in the United States to 122,000 people enrolled. We had 33 colleges in 1955, colleges and universities, 6 of which had scholastic programs, either theologians or philosophers, and we had 41 high schools. Everything was very kind of well organized and also very monastic. A note about the society in 1955, written in a book about a kind of a snapshot of the Jesuits in that era. It says, "The young candidate for the society begins his career as a novice from the moment he sets foot inside a Jesuit novitiate or house of probation, as it is officially called. At once he starts to follow the simple daily order that will continue substantially for the rest of his life. For American Jesuits, this means rising at 5:30 a.m., a brief visit to the chapel followed by an hour's private meditation, Mass at 7 o'clock followed by breakfast and a round of duties through the day and evening, until retiring at 10 p.m. After a couple of weeks, somewhat longer, if he is a candidate for the status of coadjutor brother, the novice starts to wear the black cassock, the home dress of all the Catholic clergy who do not wear some distinctive order habit." He also notes, "The novice, like novices in all religious communities, is never left to himself. He lives in close association with his fellow novices, studying with them in a common study hall, and joining with them in the games and recreation that are necessary to keep a young man alert and in good physical trim." Good physical trim, a very 1950s phrase. Sounds awfully lockstep and awfully monastic. Perhaps not quite what all of us experienced in our novitiates, certainly not what all of us experience in our daily life as Jesuits in formation and beyond. There was this lockstep quality of Jesuit formation at this time where we had become more like all religious communities, all other religious orders, where we had become more monastic. So we're becoming more monastic, very conservative in our outlook, clinging to ways of the past, but we're growing and growing and growing and growing. And the question is, what stopped the growth? Well, there is a thesis that you will hear that what stopped the growth was the Second Vatican Council and then the 32nd General Congregation, and that's when we started losing Jesuits. No, that's not true. The year in which novices, novitiate classes started to decline was 1963 in Spain, in the Spanish and U.S. assistancy, 1965 in the English assistancy and the whole society, 1966 in the German and Indian assistancies, and 1967 in the Italian, French, Slavic, and South American assistancies. All of that before JC 32, and the first signs of decline in Spain and the United States in terms of people entering the society before Vatican II was completed. So Vatican II and the 32nd General Congregation was not why numbers started going down. Numbers started going down because the bubble burst, because the things that had led to the growth were no longer as present. Maybe it was the war. A lot of people tend to think that it was sort of all of the things that World War II generated in terms of people, the disruptions to the psyche, to the sort of notion that we were going to go on progressing forever, people thinking about the meaning of life, and people who had been in the army looking and had seen the horrors they've seen, who immediately enter religious life because it felt like maybe a refuge or a way to continue in the same sort of service, or all sorts of different things. I don't know all the reasons why the 50s bubble happened, but I do know that the reason it ended is not because of Vatican II and its changes, and not because of the Second Vatican Council. And I also know that is always foolish to think that what is right now will always be. And that's how we started to think in the 1950s. We started to think, well, we'll just keep growing forever. So let's build bigger barns. Bigger communities. Let's found more schools. And we did all of that. And it was problematic. When you look at the number of novices entering between 1958 and 1970, you see the drop, and the drop, and the drop, and the drop, and the drop. And obviously we know that the last one in the chart that is provided in the PowerPoint slides, 1970, 85 novices entering the U.S. assistancy is not as low as it has gotten since. We can look at all sorts of reasons why those things are, but I think we do have to keep in mind that the call is to humility in times of consolation, and to remembering consolation in times of desolation. And the question is, yes, it's worth looking at the whys, but laying blame or criticizing important movements in the church is not a helpful narrative, and the data does not support that narrative. And that's important for us to know as faithful sons of the society and as faithful sons of the church. A few comments about leading up to the 1950s. Let's talk about the generalate of Lodachowski, Father Lodachowski, between 1915 and 1942. What's going on under his generalate? Well, let me just point to the two general congregations that he called. He called two general congregations, which is rare for a general to call congregations. The first one, General Congregation 27 in 1922. Why did he call it? To update the law of the society with the code of canon law. As you may or may not know, canon law had never been codified into one book until the beginning of the 20th century. It had been sort of a collection of precedents and various codes and things, all the way stretching back to the Middle Ages. Now in 1917, we've got a one-volume book, and there's only ever been two of those, one then, and then the 1983 code promulgated by Pope John Paul II. It's this irony of the age where church is very against modernism, this sort of notion of all these modern things that they think are anti-religious, and including some of the scientific developments and philosophy and human rights language that we didn't like as much, although with Pope Leo XIII, we embraced human rights up to a certain extent, but some of the rights, we don't agree with the rights, and we're frustrated about all these things that are in the modern world that we think are against religion. But the modernizing impulse towards systemizing everything, making things more systematic and orderly, and making a one-volume code for everything, we embrace that wholeheartedly in the church and canon law, and we embrace it wholeheartedly in the society. Not only adapting our law, but also creating at that same congregation the collected decrees of the general congregations of the Society of Jesus. In other words, instead of going to the sources, the constitutions and things like that, we decided to make a one-volume compendium of the sources, distancing ourselves from the original logic and fonts, and instead kind of saying, well, we've got a better, more codified way of doing this. So it's a real, I would argue, a real kind of prideful thing to do, to say, well, instead of going back to the sources and the actual law, we're going to create this book to give us access to the law in a more systematic, orderly fashion. It's a real kind of, we've got it all figured out now, and this will stand for all times kind of attitude, which is problematic in our discernment. It doesn't seem entirely free to me. The Second General Congregation he calls was in 1928, was GC 28 in 1938, and that was to elect a permanent vicar for him because of his poor health. Basically, someone ruled the society for him in the last years of his life because he didn't think he could resign in those days. We know later generals do. But this was a vicar without right of succession, so this is someone who just ruled in the last years of his life. Jean-Baptiste Janssens was general from 1946 at the death of Lodowski until 1964. And yet Janssens also kind of digging in on this uniformity, systemized, systematic approach to things in the society. He calls the General Congregation 30 in 1957, which really is a digging in our heels on the uniformity and conformity with other religious. So note in Decree 9, since many persons desire it, and since in these times of ours it seems most necessary that ours should better understand the spiritual teachings of our Holy Father Ignatius and be nourished by the supernatural gifts with which he founded the society and wrote its constitutions, it was therefore the desire of the congregation that a doctrinal and spiritual commentary on the Constitution should be prepared. A summary or spiritual handbook containing the principles of the Constitution should be composed. So again, more making things systematic and orderly and neat and contained. Decree 10, the congregation confirms the practice handed down over several centuries and confirmed by other general congregations, requiring all to devote an entire hour to mental prayer each day. This departure from the constitutions that was started by Francis Borgia after General Congregation II gave him the authority to do so, and then made society law by General Congregation VI, saying that all of this in the society, including the professed, are obliged to pray for an hour every day out in addition to their examens and liturgical prayers. This is a requirement that Ignatius did not want. He thought that the professed would know how to would have the desire to pray and did not need the obligation to pray. And he wanted them to have the flexibility, not to not pray, but to organize their prayer the way that they thought best, because by the time they were professed, they would be men of prayer. We were digging at our heels on this in 1957, not only saying that we should keep it, but saying that generally it's better to make it in the morning. It actually says that it's not required, but it should be. And it's also good if you assemble in one place to pray. It's not required, but it's a good thing. It's a laudable practice for everyone to gather in one place to do their prayer, making us look like other religious, digging into uniformity, all these sorts of things. And this is 1957. And in 1965, this is going to be abolished at the First General Congregation, at the 31st General Congregation, which is going to go back to the practice instituted by Ignatius in the constitutions, whereby the professed are not obliged, people in formation are. And so, again, we've got this sort of we're on top of the world, growing, all these sorts of things, all these numbers, and we've got it all figured out. We're just going to keep the same practices we've always got because, of course, it's working since we're growing and we're on top of the world. And we're going to make everything as uniform as possible. We're going to make ourselves look as much like other religious as possible, and everything's going to be great. And there could be no possibility that anything could ever change any of that. A real pride, as opposed to a real humility, is my point. Let's talk about, though, another side of the society in this time. Let's talk about scholarship in the society. On the one hand, the society was engaged in doing what the society had long done, which was supporting the Pope as theologians. And it's important to note that Jesuits were involved in two of the most important papal encyclicals of Pius XII. The primary author of Pius XII's encyclical Mystici Corporis in 1943 was a Jesuit by the name of Sebastian Trump. And this was a sort of an ecclesiological revolution that's going to kind of prepare the way for the ecclesiological decrees of the Second Vatican Council. It de-emphasized sort of the hierarchical societal understanding of the church in favor of seeing it more as the mystical body of Christ, although obviously it also emphasized the importance of the visibility of the church. This is not sort of an invisible church, but a real church, an embodied church. This is a really important encyclical. Jesuits were behind that. At the same time, in the same year, Divino Afflante Spiritu comes out, which is mostly written by the German Jesuit Augustin Bea, who was the rector of the Biblicum, which we ran and still run. It's on biblical interpretation. It calls for updated scholarly editions of the Bible in original languages, and encourages textual and historical critical criticism of Scripture, and encourages more and better vernacular translations of the Scriptures. The cultivation of studying the Bible. We had been very opposed in the Catholic Church to the new approaches to studying the Bible because they had come not just from Protestant sources, but often from people who were pretty much, some of them weren't even actual Protestant sources. They'd been trained in the Protestant churches, but they were pretty skeptical of faith and attacking belief and traditional theology. And the church had sort of reacted against all of this and said, all this biblical critical, historical biblical critical stuff is against the faith, and we're going to oppose it. And we need to dig into the way we've always done things. With this encyclical written by a Jesuit, mostly, Pope Pius XII changed the story and said, no, we can do this in a Catholic way. And so Jesuits were on the forefront of these important changes. At the same time, famous Jesuit theologians were also at the forefront of some other changes. Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, and Joseph Youngman, all very important theologians who were working before the council. De Lubac was sort of focused on ecclesiology. Karl Rahner, ecclesiology, Christology, systematic theology in general. Joseph Youngman focused on the liturgy. He wrote, in 1948, he wrote a history of the Roman rite of the Mass, which was very important. All of these guys, absolutely essential at Vatican II. Rahner and de Lubac are both, however, condemned. Not their persons, but their teachings prior to Vatican II. And I just want to talk about that for a second, because I think sometimes people get the wrong idea about these condemnations. So the first thing that's important is Henri de Lubac and Karl Rahner were told they couldn't teach and publish, and so they didn't. They didn't leave the church. They didn't defy their orders. They were obedient. When they were told that what they were saying was problematic, they stopped. They were faithful. They were faithful Jesuits, and that's important to understand. They went too far from the perspective of the papacy, and yet they were willing to step back. Not too many years later, they become architects of some of the most important decrees of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes in particular. They're very important with both de Lubac and Rahner, and Youngman, of course, important on the liturgical things, although he hadn't been condemned. The point of all this is, I want to say, is these Jesuits they were doing what we were supposed to do, being on the frontiers of knowledge at the service of the papacy, and they thought that they were being faithful in what they were doing. And when they were told that what they were doing was problematic, they stopped, and they were faithful, and they waited. And that's important to understand. It's also important to understand that all of these things that seem like they were, this is a period where we're digging in our heels into uniformity and conservatism, and looking back, that was not the case everywhere in the church. Pius XII was starting to look forward in the 1950s, and some Jesuits were starting to look forward, and Jesuits were doing this in the best way that they could to be faithful to the church, and sometimes making missteps or or being misunderstood, but yet struggling to be faithful and to serve the church and the Pope as best as they could. I think the important thing to understand in all of this is about discernment, of course, is that the key lesson is to focus on where is God's grace amid the consolations and the desolations that we experience. In consolation, we're called to be humble. And in desolation, we're called to remember that God will ultimately console us. I think these theologian Jesuits understood that maybe better than the society as a whole, that was sort of a little prideful at this moment. And to bring up sort of a disturbing note in this, the pride of the society, the growth of the society at this time was such that we had these enormous classes of novices and these enormous groups of guys in formation. And amid all of that, we didn't dedicate tons and tons of guys to working in formation, because of course we needed them to be working in our schools and our retreat houses and our parishes. Instead, we relied on the structures, these perfect monastic structures, to train these guys, instead of giving them the sort of individual attention that was called for by our documents and was the practice of the early society. We trusted the structures instead of putting in more men to do the training. Why is that important? Well, because it was a pretty prideful thing to do, to trust that we could create perfect structures that were going to solve our problems. And I would argue that it's part of how we created the possibility for some of the worst future abusers to remain Jesuits. Because when no one's paying enough attention to the individuals, it's easy for people to be passed along through formation without much attention being given to them. Now, no formation program is perfect. But when we're relying on the system as opposed to paying attention to people, it's even less perfect. And I think that the reason why the highest number of abuse cases came out of people who entered in this period is partly because there were a lot of people who should not have been passed along, where when we were relying on the system instead of trusting in Christ and paying attention to people. There was a pride in the way that we were going about what we were doing. And that's an important lesson for us as we discern. How do we avoid that pride? How do we stay humble in our consolations? And how do we stay hopeful in our desolations? And that's a lesson, a point that is well worth pondering, and that I hope you can have the time to ponder. Thank you.